Prop bears culpability for the harms that arose from misapplications of the 2016 CDC pain guidelines. Internists, not even doctors, not even like proper doctors with like years of experience as internists, CDC data were clearly manipulated in irregular ways for political purposes. They really should have seen the fentanyl crisis coming. Instead, they decided to blame pharmaceutical opioids. People are dying because of this. Also, they can profit. Hello everyone, yes I know, I'm trying to get back into the swing of things after Hurricane Helene. We got the lights back on, yay, we got internet back. We're back into civilization, we're not living like cavemen anymore. And we've got all of the stuff in our fridge thrown away and replaced because of course there was no way to keep it from going bad, so I don't know, if you want to help out with that, donate.bogosity.tv, help us get back into normal life again after the hurricane. A lot of places still out of power in the mountains mainly, but yeah, it's really bad. And I promise I am going to do the AMA. I'm going to work on that after this. I don't know if I'll be able to record before I have to do this week's podcast or not, but it's coming up, trust me. But for now, in a previous video in the opioid playlist that I've been doing, I mentioned I hadn't really been talking about this group called PROP and how important they are. I've kind of been nicking at the edges of them, but I told you I'd do a video on it, so this is a good article on it published in PallyMed. It's from a few years ago, so it's not quite up to date, but it's going to supplement a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. We're going to do some skipping, but there's still a lot of good new stuff in here that we haven't really covered. And so he's talking, and this was back in 2021, the study from the CDC, I believe we covered that, has captured the attention of the palliative care and chronic pain communities. Age-adjusted overdose death rates involving synthetic opioids, psychostimulants, cocaine, heroin, and prescription opioids during 2013 to 2019 have increased a whopping 1,040%. Why did it increase that much? Because they were going after the wrong target. They were going after pain patients. That's the wrong target. They should have been going after the black market opioids. And so this is failed federal opioid policy, particularly the 2016 CDC guidelines. We've covered those. And their misapplication. This criticism has generated a recent flurry of activity on social media by the anti-opioid advocacy group Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, PROP. And you're going to see these guys all over the place. They've been around. And so it says, in 2011, a group of internists, not even doctors, not even like proper doctors with like years of experience as internists, co-authored an article that modern palliative care physicians would recognize as a warning shot in the world of opioid policy. They announced the creation of PROP, a nonprofit organization with no pharmaceutical industry funding or ties. Yeah, but with ties to lawyers who wanted to sue the pharmaceutical companies. That would identify practical approaches to more cautious opioid prescribing in community practice. They declared that guidelines for long-term opioid therapy should not be developed by the field of pain medicine alone. Rather, experts from general medicine, addiction medicine, and pain medicine should jointly reconsider how to increase the margin of safety. Alright, so they send out their little petition. In July 2012, PROP submitted a petition to the FDA calling for a change in labeling. And PROP requested that the FDA do three things. Strike the term moderate from the indication for non-cancer pain. The only clinical indication for using an opioid analgesic would be for severe cancer pain. 2. Add a maximum daily dose of opioid analgesia equivalent to 100 MME. We've talked about that, milligram morphine equivalent. You're going to see that all through this one as well. For treatment of all non-cancer pain, and a maximum duration of 90 days for continuous daily opioid analgesia use for non-cancer pain, after which opioid analgesia would be discontinued, regardless of the cause or the extent of your chronic pain or your needs. You don't get opioids for longer than 90 days, unless you have cancer, which is weird and arbitrary. So you get Backlash. You have the American Society for Addiction Medicine. Their president, Stu Gitlow, talked about substantial concerns from the pain management and palliative medical communities about the potential reduced access to opioid therapy for many patients, in response to concerns that the prop petition might have a chilling effect on medically legitimate opioid prescribing. And Gitlow said the relabeling proposals were not intended in any way to limit a chronic pain patient's access to clinically appropriate opioid pain therapy, even though that's exactly what they did, or to impinge upon a pain specialist's ability to make individual decisions regarding the most effective therapy for their legitimate pain patient. Several prominent pain management experts echoed important concerns about over-restricting patients' medically legitimate access to opioid analgesics. And this is Bob Twillman of the American Academy of Pain Management. The 90-day limit on use of opioid for non-cancer pain was arbitrarily chosen. Prop's petition had criticized the use of long-term opioid therapy by citing a lack of evidence for opioids' long-term effectiveness. But when considering opioid analgesics, the FDA had used the standard of a 12-week trial for the medication. It has not required longer studies. The reason why they didn't show any evidence is because they didn't look. And then Russell Portnoy of the New York State Palliative Care Education and Training Council wrote that in light of the stunning disconnect between the label changes demanded in the petition and the scientific basis presented to justify them, which was basically none, I am concerned that all of the signatories possess an incomplete understanding of opioid pharmacology and pain medicine and, as a result, may pursue regulatory changes that are not in the best interest of public health. And other prop critics included several medical professional organizations like the American Society of Anesthesiologists, and they said, who will decide whether the persistent pain, for example, of nerve damage incurred during an otherwise curative course of chemo and radiation therapy is or is not cancer-related? If it's just kind of an add-on, if it's something that happens after it, because of it, but tangentially related, if it's cancer-adjacent, does that count? Likewise, the American Academy of Pain Medicine stated, we have serious concerns about the petition and believe the rationale for the requested changes is seriously flawed, potentially harmful to patients with debilitating pain conditions for whom opioid therapy is indicated, and without substantive scientific foundation. So basically, all of the experts are saying that these interns got it wrong. The American Pain Society cited similar concerns about the petition's insufficient scientific evidence base to support its recommendations. Further, we are concerned that implementation of these labeling changes, which would dictate indications, dosing, and duration of opioid treatment, will not accomplish the intended goals, but instead have unintended negative consequences for patients, including but not limited to untreated pain and loss of access to individualized care. All right, we've got the FDA's response to this. And the main point here is the FDA disagreed with the most important requests from PROP. It rejected their separation of non-cancer pain from cancer, noting a patient without cancer, like a patient with cancer, may suffer from chronic pain. And PROP has not provided scientific support for why labeling should recommend different treatment for such patients. The FDA also rejected PROP's call for a 100 MME daily dose limitation, noting the scientific literature does not support establishing a maximum recommended dose of 100 MME. And the FDA noted that creating a maximum dose of 100 MME could imply a superior opioid safety profile under that set threshold when there is no data to support that conclusion. And as for the 90-day thing, they said it was not supportable based on the evidence presented in the petition. Well, they didn't get a lot of love for the FDA. So what are a bunch of political activists to do? They find an agency more receptive, and they did. Ultimately, PROP identified a more accommodating regulatory agency than the FDA, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. How much have we covered about how horrible the CDC is? So they get another backlash because CDC had failed to disclose what outside advisors it consulted with during the drafting of its controversial opioid prescribing guidelines for physicians. And check this out, they're supposed to have a comment period where members of the public or experts or whoever can come and say what they think about this. They had an unusually short 48-hour period for stakeholders to submit concerns about the CDC pain guidelines. And then you have revelations that at least 5 PROP board members had served on the panels that helped develop the CDC guidelines, and that stirred deeper concerns. Media professional organizations joined in criticism of the CDC for a lack of transparency and the scarcity of pain management experts. They didn't even have anyone who knew what they were talking about. Oh, let's scroll down a bit, because a lot of this is stuff we've covered before about the guidelines, and they publish them, and then there's the AMA backlash. Then we have this part in 2016. A group of scientists from the CDC itself expressed integrity concerns about the agency's data and the current state of ethics, noting that it appears that our mission is being influenced and shaped by outside parties and rogue interests. CDC data were clearly manipulated in irregular ways for political purposes. The CDC was being influenced by corporate and political interests in a way that compromised its data collection. Despite these warnings, the 2016 CDC opioid prescribing guidelines were implemented as planned. Just 2 years later, yet another article, authored by CDC scientists, was published April 2018, again calling into question the methodology used by CDC to estimate opioid overdose deaths. And the author said they overestimated deaths due to prescription opioids because the CDC failed to account for the emergence of illicitly manufactured fentanyl. Just as we've covered several other ways, they knew it in the CDC. They knew about this. And also, we have the self-exit issue. By 2018, it had become clear that misapplication of its pain guidelines had begun to contribute to deaths from suicides, from forced or involuntary tapers off of opioid analgesics. And remember, as we covered, the CDC knows for a fact that this happens, and they refuse to do anything about it. They even refuse to so much as count them to find out who many they are. But again, you go around on the pain management forums, you'll find them. All the people who say they have a plan in place for what they'll do if they lose access to their medicine. That's how much pain they're in. That's not an addiction. All right, and we covered the AMA's policies. And we also have in December 2018, a group of clinical leaders and international stakeholders in the pain management community signed an open letter calling for urgent action against forced tapering of opioids. I'm not going to read through the details on all these. You can read them yourself. March 6, 2019, a group identified as health professionals for patients in pain called upon the CDC to follow through with its commitment to evaluate the impact by consulting directly with a wide range of patients and caregivers and by engaging epidemiologic experts to investigate reported suicides, increases in illicit opioid use, and, to the extent possible, expressions of suicidal ideation following involuntary opioid taper or discontinuation. By the way, I'm just going to apologize if I end up having to censor this because of stupid YouTube. Hopefully they'll let this go through, but if there's bleeps and cover-ups on the screen, sorry about that. Alright, we covered both the FDA warning and the CDC backpedaling, so we are going to scroll down quite a bit. This is where we get into the undeclared conflicts of interests, who these people at Prop actually are. The DOJ announced a record-setting $1.4 billion settlement against Reckitt Benckiser, I know I'm butchering that, the manufacturer of Suboxone, an opioid addiction treatment drug. However good Suboxone might be for addiction, among pain patients, this is like a poison pill. Because they try to move pain patients over to Suboxone, and it does nothing for pain. It is not indicated for pain. For years, critics had alleged financial connections between Prop members and Reckitt Benckiser. And they talk about Andrew Kolodny, he was then the president of Prop, and he kept claiming that they're not a pharmaceutical company, they make Lysol. They can do both, you idiot. So then they spun off Suboxone to a subsidiary. In recorded testimony during government hearings, Kolodny had encouraged the use of Suboxone as a measure to combat the opioid crisis. However, Kolodny failed to disclose conflicts of interest pursuant to his executive directorship of Prop and provision of expert witness testimony in malpractice cases involving opioids when he published 2 articles in JAMA in 2017 and 2018. Failed to mention that he was making good money in those cases, being paid lots of money by those lawyers, suing those pharmaceutical companies, and suing doctors and everyone else. Similarly, Prop President Jane Ballantyne failed to disclose her affiliation with Prop in an Ideas and Opinions article co-authored with Prop members. Mark Sullivan failed to declare a conflict of interest regarding his work on an opioid tapering device, which occurred during his participation in the drafting of the CDC pain guidelines until he was participating in a CDC-sponsored clinical outreach and community activity after the guidelines publication. So, this is a guy who makes money tapering people off of opioids, and he's involved in these guidelines, and he doesn't even reveal it. And the BMJ had to update a rapid response that accused the AMA of a pharmaceutical industry bias when creating opioid policy, written by several members of Prop, when it was revealed that one of the co-authors, Prop Sullivan, did not disclose his competing interest related to his work as an expert witness in cases in Maryland and Missouri. They're hiding who they are. Why would you have to do that if you're on the level? Okay, more on the CDC backpedaling and the AMA concerns. We covered all that, so let's scroll down. And this next part is about the fact that opioid overdose deaths went up as opioid prescriptions went down. We've covered that too. Here we go. Inaccurate CDC data on opioid deaths. Just a few weeks later, Prop's troubles worsened with the publish of an article by John Pepin and John C. Coleman in Pain Therapy that detailed fundamental methodological shortcomings in CDC's data on prescription overdose deaths. CDC erroneously reported prescription opioid overdose deaths in 2016 and for more than a decade before, because remember, we've got all this starting around 2005, 2006, at a time when they really should have seen the fentanyl crisis coming. Instead, they decided to blame pharmaceutical opioids in a way that overestimated overdose deaths due to prescribed opioids. The CDC ignored the problem until 2016 data showed serious inconsistencies with other, more reputable data for prescribing volumes of opioids. For more than a decade, millions of Americans were misled into believing that opioid overdoses, once almost always due to heroin use, are now increasingly due to abuse of prescription painkillers. Little did they know or suspect that the CDC's coding of prescription painkillers included non-prescribed, illicitly manufactured fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, and non-prescribed methadone administered or dispensed to patients being treated for opioid use disorder. This report again exposed PROP's and CDC's false narrative that overprescribing of opioid analgesics had driven the U.S. overdose crisis. And then in 2021, Kolodny produced a webinar in which he refuted several alleged myths and false narratives about the opioid crisis. This presentation was swiftly characterized as a rambling dialogue by Kolodny that gaslighted pain sufferers, doctors, patient advocates, and anyone else critical of the CDC guideline. For example, in a clear example of a straw man argument, Kolodny alleged a myth that the CDC guideline forced millions of patients off opioids, resulting in an epidemic of suicides, when in fact, both the CDC and the FDA had publicly acknowledged the potential harms of forced tapers, acknowledging that the extent of the harm was not yet known. In response to legitimate concerns about harms from policies influenced by PROP's advocacy, one of its individual members had responded with gaslighting, informal fallacies, and deflection aimed apparently at creating plausible deniability for their contribution to those harms. Most of this is their fault. PROP has had a disproportionate effect on opioid policy in the United States for almost a decade. Also, they can profit. Just so they can profit. They can make money working for these shysters, giving bogus expert testimony in courts against pharmaceutical companies and doctors and pharmacists, just trying to bully them and stop them from prescribing opioids. That's how they make their money. PROP found a willing federal regulatory partner in the CDC, and while PROP may not have secretly written the 2016 CDC pain guidelines, they certainly enjoy disproportionate representation on CDC's review panels and core expert group. When the CDC admitted that its pain guideline had been widely misapplied and joined the FDA in a call against forced opioid tapers, PROP doubled down on its rhetoric, dismissing legitimate concerns about potential harms in a performative manner that encouraged their ongoing misapplication while assailing PROP's critics. All of this has occurred as PROP members have repeatedly concealed relevant conflicts of interest, including key conflicts that should have been disclosed during the process of drafting the CDC pain guidelines. At a minimum, PROP should no longer enjoy a prominent role in guiding future opioid policy in the United States. This is a particularly urgent concern as Roger Chu has been linked to authorship of CDC's new pain guidelines, which have not yet been released to the public. Chu's involvement in yet another set of guidelines and CDC's recurrent lack of transparency in identifying the new guidelines authors should alarm all advocates who support access to pain medications for all patients with a medically legitimate indication for opioid therapy. Beyond limiting PROP's role in developing future potentially harmful opioid policy, a reasonable individual would be justified in wondering to what extent PROP bears culpability for the harms that arose from misapplications of the 2016 CDC pain guidelines. It's a lot. I'm telling you that. It's a lot. In our country, civil suits, like class action lawsuits for example, only require a preponderance of the evidence, something that is more likely than not as the burden of proof for liability. All you have to do is just tip that your way just a little bit. It's not like in a criminal case where it's beyond all reasonable doubt. You just gotta kind of have to tip it your way a little bit. It is more likely than not that PROP's efforts to affect opioid policy helped shape the CDC guidelines, which CDC has admitted were misapplied harmfully. It is also more likely than not that PROP's performative advocacy efforts contributed to misapplication of the CDC guidelines. And it is more likely than not that widespread misapplication of the CDC guidelines resulted in harms with attendant civil liability. This would expose PROP to civil liability with a potentially enormous settlement if a class action suit were to arise from those harmed by the misapplication of the CDC guidelines. Perhaps that is why PROP member Andrew Kolodny and others have worked so hard recently to create plausible deniability in the wake of the damaging February 12, 2021 MMWR report. And now you know who PROP is, and now you know what they're all about, and now you know how all this bogus information got out there. And now you know how important it is to pass this on, because this is causing real harm. This is costing lives. And it's not even a speculative thing. People are dying because of this. Dying. Pain is not in your head. Pain is throughout all the nerves in your body. It's in your muscles. It affects your immune system. It affects your digestive system. It affects your cardiovascular system. It affects every single system in your body. It is vital that chronic pain patients have what we need to get our pain down to manageable levels. If you don't want to get us out of pain, at least let us get it down to the level where it isn't an issue. And so many people are against that, and there is no good reason for it. The only good reason for stopping pain patients from getting their medicine is if you are pure evil. And that's just all there is to it. Thank you so very much for watching. Comments for the comment god, shares for the share through, and please hit like, subscribe, and the bell. And as always, donate.bogosity.tv really helped me out after this hurricane. This was a bad one. I think this might have been worse than Hugo. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check, but man, as bad as Hugo was, this was terrible. So go there. You can donate with PayPal, Venmo, or cryptocurrency, or become a regular supporter, Patreon, Subscribestar, Discord. Get these videos early and ad-free. Other benefits, I just mentioned the AMA. I promise I'm going to work on that. Just let me get this out first. I also do have another Lord Killian video coming as soon as I can get back to working on that. And part of the problem is this woman is so stupid I can only take about 45 seconds of her at a time. Oh my God, wait until you see this woman. Yeah, she's going to be coming up. So if you want to get that as early as you can, become a regular supporter and also other benefits. Thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, stay strong and be free.